This is The Other 51. I'm Brian, and this week my guest is author, writer, journalist, and rock star, literal rock star, Dave Bidini. My guest this week is an author, he is a journalist, he is a publisher, he is an actual rock star, and a Maple Leafs fan. He's a little bit of everything. Dave Bidini, welcome to The Other 51.
Hey, Brian, it's great to be here.
Great to have you. This is a thrill for me. I listened to a lot of Rheostatics during my college years. Saw you guys play at least twice that I can remember, maybe more. So this is very cool to get to talk to you. Nice.
Yeah, I know. I'm happy to spend some time.
Yeah,
talking about stuff.
So it's to get ready for this for today. I started rereading parts of On a Cold Road, the book you wrote, which is kind of a part oral history of Canadian music, part diary of your tour with the Tragically Hip in '96 that we were just talking about. And that book holds up. It is still so interesting and so fun to read.
I appreciate that. Yeah. Well, one thing that could never be said about Canadian arts and culture is that those stories have been overtold, because, for a long time, and I think to a certain extent to this day, I think we're good in certain corners when it comes to kind of, mythologizing the country, the cultural and artistic and certainly rock and roll musical parts of the country, but as a whole, not so much. So, I think locally, really, like, community to community, there's always the stories of, local bands and sort of small town heroes and stuff. And the icons are certainly celebrated, but there's that vast kind of middle that kind of gets lost. And I think that's partly what that book tried to address. So I'm glad that it still reads as a relevant thing.
What does when you look back on that time and on that book coming out, like what does that book kind of mean to you with the benefit of 20 some years of hindsight?
Well, for me, it was just kind of a great way on a personal level to sort of force myself to kind of write down all those stories, and especially now being in my, being 57, my memory's pretty good. It's one of the things that I think Gord Downey and I really shared. We had this steel trap memory, but as you get a bit older, some stuff, some events wash into other events and shows wash into other shows, and it's nice to have kind of that document of that time, just for me, as almost like a personal reference point, and certainly for those bands as well, who, all of whom, those musicians, a good 20 years older than me. So I'm grateful that they were able to honor me with their time to participate, and have those stories in there for themselves too. And, readers and really listeners and fans still come to them through that book, and they tell me that, and they'll, people who read that book now will research those bands in there, because for a whole new generation, bands of the 60s and 70s are, not, they're lost to a lot of people, and a lot of, people who love music in Canada and elsewhere who, weren't around when those songs were on the radio and stuff. So it's kind of, it's proved really useful as a kind of compendium, which is something I'm really proud of.
So looking back over kind of the span of your creative career, you have the time in both the Rheostatics and with your solo stuff. You've written books. You've been a journalist. You're now a journalism publisher. The common thread through a lot of this seems to be writing at kind of the core of it. Do you kind of view it that way? I mean, is writing kind of something that you set out to do or always wanted to do, or did you kind of just like fall into it?
Yeah, I was writing before I was ever playing guitar. Writing was something that sort of came effortlessly to me. I read about this a little bit in some of the books, but about how, the typewriter, like the family typewriter, was the one, instrument, appliance, whatever, that I was allowed to have as my own, and I was allowed to kind of go down there in the basement and hammer away at this thing and just kind of, make nonsense on the pages, even from when I was a really, really young kid, an infant. And, I became aware of its power, I think, a little bit when I got to school, in middle school, and, English classes and writing classes, and realizing I kind of had a bit of a head start.
Okay.
Apart from other students and stuff. And so it was always really there for me. Another thing about, when you're growing up too, like books as kids, like books and toys, like those are the things that are yours. Right.
Right.
And I think they possess, for me anyways, they possessed a real sort of, aura or power, because they were things that were alone with me in my room, and they were mine. As a kid, when you get a book, the first thing you do is you put your name in it, right? Especially if you're going to, take it to a friend's house or take it to school, right? So people know it's yours. And I think that kind of like, that allegiance or whatever, my faith was with writing before it was with music. So it's been constant in my life for sure.
Yeah, the book point is fantastic. Like I never thought of it like that, but absolutely. Like I was the same way. My mom and my sister and I have talked about this. We always got books for our birthday. Like we get toys and clothes and all this stuff, but she made a point. You always got books, and that was so important. Yep. And my daughter's the same way. She's 10 now, and like she's super protective of her Percy Jackson books and all those books, and those are hers. What were the ones that you remember that kind of maybe had a little more or power to you that really drew you in?
Well, I think my life has been, kind of meted out by, and it still is, by, the kind of the texts, the books that, have come through my orbit. Early days, it was really kind of like anybody. It was certainly comic books, and the writing of Edgar Rice Burroughs and C.S. Lewis and Hardy Boys and all that kind of stuff too. But it really wasn't, it wasn't until I guess I was, 10, 11, 12, 9, 10, 11, 12 that I would, read hockey digests, and I would read about, a book about Bobby Clark or there was a great book called, I think it was called like Strange But True Hockey Stories. And, where those stories kind of mythologized the game, and they were hardcover, but they were cheap. And you could buy them at at the mall, and actually they used to sell them in some variety stores and stuff too. So, and then later kind of rock and roll books about Alice Cooper and Robert Plant and stuff like that. And really, none of it would ever be confused with like top level, journalism or prose or high literature or high art. But they were great. There were great stories in those books and stuff. So, those in the beginning, and then. I was just thinking a little bit before our conversation just about, writing about sports and just sort of realizing that, as I became a young adult in my 20s, and maybe late teens as well, we would go to a bookstore in Toronto called This Ain't the Rosedale Library. And I'll just explain that name a little bit. Rosedale is a really sort of, elite, a high rent, part of the city, beautiful houses, very white upper crust, Presbyterian. And the bookstore was on Queen Street for a while. Then it was in the Gay Village on Church. So the ironic nature of the name of that bookstore was This Ain't the Rosedale Library. And but they had, I would walk in there, and I, would put all of my trust into Charlie and Dan, who were the two guys that ran the bookstore. And they would see me come in, and they would already have books kind of ready for me to read. And it's certainly with sports, they turned me on to Roger Angell, Thomas Boswell, Mark Harris, Paul Quarrington, like all of the great sports voices that, Peter Gollenbach's book Bums was a real massive influence on a Cold Road,
Okay.
and some of the other books too, because it was the oral history of the Brooklyn Dodgers. And, it's interesting too, and I always have to defend sort of sports writing to people because structurally, and you look at Donald Hall's In the Country of Baseball, which is the book he wrote with Doc Ellis, structurally, and Fathers Playing Catch with Sons, structurally those books are really interesting. And Bums is certainly structurally very interesting too, because of the hundreds of voices that Gollenbach interviewed, and the way he assembled sort of the chronological story of the Brooklyn Dodgers. But anyways, those books, as I was starting to, pay more attention, I think, to how books were made and how they were assembled, those early books that I would have got from that bookstore would have been huge to sort of shaping my ideas about what you could do when it came to writing books specifically.
So what was it about sports writing? I mean, you mentioned the structure of some of those books, but in general, not just, I know you're a sports fan, you're a hockey fan, but what about, like, from a writing perspective, what about sports writing and the sports writing that you like kind of speaks to you on that bigger level and influence kind of how you see the world and how you see writing?
Yeah, I could answer that question on a lot of levels, but I'll try to not be too long-winded here. But certainly with it was interesting to me that especially in the early days when you'd read newspaper columns, right? So you'd read the great sports writers of the 60s and 70s here in Toronto, certainly, like Milton Allen, Trent Frayne, Stephen Brunt, Damien Cox, and they would be writing about something that we had both seen. Whether it was the Olympics or boxing or hockey or baseball or whatever. And it was fascinating to kind of see how they would tell those stories. And skill and the craft and the language they would use to describe something that I'd seen. So it really kind of, it showed me kind of what tools you could use, I think, to tell those kind of stories, and they were telling it in the immediate as well. And I talked to Brunt about when we toured in 1987. That was our first band tour across Canada, and that's the basis for a lot of the storytelling in On a Cold Road. But I remember, buying the Globe and Mail and cutting columns out of the paper and pasting them in these scrapbooks that I kept. They were small kind of artist sketchbooks, and I would write lyrics and stories in there and stuff too, and some little bit of some art or whatever. But I would clip these columns and I'd paste them in there. I remember telling Brunt about this one story that he wrote about a Saskatchewan Roughriders football rally at Maple Leaf Gardens, and it was a stunningly beautiful column about the prairies landing in the big city and celebrating their culture and their life, in one of the most storied buildings in Canada, and this home of the Maple Leafs and so on and so forth. And I loved it. I cut it out, and I got to talk to him later, and I said, that column I kept in my book, and I still go back to it and I read it sometimes. And he told me that he wrote that column from at 5:00 on a Thursday. It was a Bulldog column. He told me he wrote it in the sudden sort of heat of the moment. He had to file, and it made the late editions or something. And anyways, it was great to be able to talk to him about that, because it had such a huge kind of impact on me. And so, from there, it just kind of, the nature of that kind of writing drew me to it. But I sensed an opportunity with Tropic of Hockey where the sports writing, while it was, really creative, and the language was really interesting, it was never really considered kind of in Canada anyways, a progressive framework for writing. There were a lot of, certainly in hockey, there were a lot of books that were, bios of Gordie Howe and Gretzky, and it never really kind of pushed where sort of sports writing could go the way it had, I think, with baseball writing in the States and with those writers. So I kind of sensed an opportunity to take certainly with hockey writing, to take it to kind of to a new place, and write about it in a way that it hadn't been written before.
Do you still keep notebooks like that, like the one you kept on that tour?
Well, I haven't toured for a bit.
Right.
So no. And I haven't traveled for a bit, for obvious reasons. But the last book I wrote was my experiences in the Northwest Territories in Yellowknife. So I'll do that when I'm away. Listen, when you're traveling and you're meeting people and you're going to new places, you're not going to take notes on your phone. You're not going to use, that audio. Yeah, a notebook. And a notebook is a really unintimidating way too of, especially if you're meeting someone for the first time and they're telling you a story, or, you're talking to them. It's a soft presence. The sound of somebody scribbling in their book is not an intimidating one. And people, in fact, it can actually work as a kind of a relaxing presence in a way, when you're trying to get a story down.
So I'm curious to I'm curious about writing processes a lot, and especially the songwriting process. Yeah. So I'm curious, what's your songwriting process been like within the band when you were at the Rheostatics and kind of solo?
Yeah. It's really, songs vary song to song, okay, in terms of the way they're put together. Sometimes a song can, be a little figure on the guitar, and other times it can be the lyric to the chorus. And other times it can be, you go into a song through a certain door, and then you leave it, and then you come back through a completely different door, whether that's a change in, voice, a change in tone, a change in, key. It's really, I wish I could, that's why there's never, that's why those how to write songs, or, those books don't really work, because they don't, there's no one standard that really applies. There's a million different ways of doing it.
Gotcha. So, along with the books you've written and the songs that you've written, you run a newspaper now. For about 4 or 5 years now, you've been publishing and running the West End Phoenix in Toronto. It's a very cool paper, by the way. So
Thank you.
I'm curious where that idea come from. Why did you decide to start a newspaper and a print newspaper in the late 2010s?
Well, probably, it probably does tie back to, what we were talking about originally of, about love of newspapers as a kid, and love of columnists, and love of print. But, I mentioned I had written about my experiences in Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories. My last book was Midnight Light. It's about a summer I spent in Yellowknife working at the Yellowknifer newspaper. And I wanted to write a city book about the North. I wasn't really interested in writing about, being on the land. There's a lot of those kind of books in Canadian literature. So I wanted to kind of know how cities worked up there. And there's only, just a handful of them. So Yellowknife was the one that was most welcoming to me, I think, that I visited. And I throughout all my travels, it wasn't until 2013 that I went there. And I also found out there hadn't really been books written about Yellowknife. So it seemed, again, kind of a good opportunity to write one. So I went up there and worked at the paper. And while I was there, there was a reporter for the Yellowknifer, John McFadden, was arrested for obstructing a police investigation. So I ended up spending more time than I'd bargained for over the next year and a half following his trial up there. And the narrative for that trial was basically the cops versus the newspaper, which seemed like a narrative pulled from the 1940s. So that was sort of my year and a half, 2 years. And when I came back, I wrote the book, but I realized I really didn't have as much fun writing that book. Writing's always a trial anyways, but I didn't have as much fun writing that book as I had working at the newspaper. So I looked around the communities where we live in the West End of Toronto and discovered that all the community newspapers had been bought by a large media company here and basically gouged of all content. And I thought, maybe it was an opportunity to kind of bring back community news and to sort of rethink what a community newspaper could be. And I did it old style. I knocked on doors in our neighborhood. I had about 800 subscribers signed up before we printed a single newspaper. So I knew there was kind of an appetite for it. And yeah, we've been publishing for about 4.5 years, and we start our 5th year in September. And it's captured the imagination of people, and the sense of community and supporting local initiatives has really risen, certainly during the pandemic, but even before then. So I think our timing was a little bit innate, which is nice, and it's just great to see people in our neighborhoods turning their attention towards supporting the journalists and the writers, who live and work in our communities, as opposed to searching for stuff for free on the internet all the time. And so it's been one of the few positive, good news stories when it comes to newspapers, over the last 4 or 5 years. So yeah, we're thrilled with how it's all happening.
So what's your vision for what can a community newspaper be, and what should a community newspaper be, especially in 2021?
I mean, it's important to tell our stories to each other. The more we know of each other's story, the closer, we are as neighbors, and as people, just sharing the same kind of experiences. And, also one of the things we tried to do too was, in our neighborhood, we have some of Canada's greatest playwrights, novelists, poets living within a 10-block radius of each other. And Margaret Atwood's been an early supporter. She's a book reviewer for us. And but we just thought, instead of, and Canadians have always kind of lapsed a little bit, they defaulted to the setting of trying to write sort of broadly, and certainly trying to write for a global audience as opposed to a local audience. So we really tried to train, that focus inwards, and dignify the butcher at the corner with the story of their life, and write about things that are happening at the end of our street as opposed to things that are happening at the end of the world. So at the other end of the world. So that's kind of the thrust behind the paper, and when people have responded to it because they've never really seen their neighborhoods painted that way before. And the writers are into it too. And listen, with the pandemic, people aren't traveling anyways, right? So people are around, and the writers are able to, walk a couple of blocks to find out what's happening on that street corner and why that person is opening this business, and just telling stories of park life and city life and neighborhood life. So it's engaged the imagination of the writers and the readers on that level, I think.
One of the things that I think about a lot in terms of writing and journalism is the importance of place, and the importance of kind of location and setting. And certainly that's a common thread that runs through a lot of your work, whether it's kind of Canadian music, whether it's your neighborhood with your newspaper. And I'm curious, what makes a good Canada story, or a good Toronto story, or a good West End story? Like, what is the sense of place that makes something that lends itself to a good story in your experience?
Well, geez, that's a tough question. I mean, I think stories can obviously be assembled like so many different ways, and I think it's, and I think this kind of gets back to what I was saying about the hockey writing is like, I think it's important to sort of look at something that people judge as sort of being commonplace and occurring kind of everywhere in our everyday life, but looking at it as if it's just happening, as if it's new, just like a real kind of maybe mundane example is that, that weird tree that's been across the street, growing on your neighbor's lawn, every spring it, blooms, and then it's haggard in the fall and the winter, and then it comes to life, and just kind of look out your window and you see it every day. But we want to sort of see it in a new way, and we want to kind of bring a new vision to that kind of writing, if that makes any sense. Mm-hmm. Certainly in cities, we take cities for granted, and I think we take places for granted. And it does get back to those early Rheostatics tours where, honestly, for me and for a lot of the band, going to Winnipeg and going to Regina going to Sudbury, going to Thunder Bay was like traveling to like Berlin and Warsaw and Paris. For us, we'd never been anywhere. So to go to these places and find these different communities, like that was our parchment, that we've all used in our lives. Whenever I travel, someone once told me, go to where the old people drink, which I think is really advice. And I've always said, if you can find a musical community in whatever town you're in, you're going to find people who are going to accept you and embrace you. And that's certainly proven true wherever I've gone. I think you could sort of say the same in any art form, really. If you can find the writers, if you can find the poets, you can find the musicians, if you're a carpenter and you find the carpenters, like that's, you look for people you can relate to, have those kind of baked in communities, and then you'll discover things about the world that you'll never forget. So that all kind of comes back to touring, but it also comes back to writing about the community where people are discovering each other through the writing and through the storytelling.
So I ask all my guests on the podcast this, so I'll ask you, what's the best thing you've read lately?
I just finished the book about the making of Midnight Cowboy, which I really liked. I also read Roddy Doyle's Love, which I think is a beautiful book, which was a real slow burn. But I was really drawn into it and think it's a beautiful book. And I also have, during this pandemic, have discovered the writings of Alexandra Fuller, who's a South African. She's lived part of her life, mostly in Zambia, actually. But her books are fucking incredible. So, those are kind of the handful of books that I've been kicking around, and reading Bill Bryson's book about the body right now. But boy, what a great time to read, man. Like every now and then I'll sort of put out on Twitter that I've got some books for sale, and they've never gone that quickly before out the door. It's great. I think we're living in a time where reading and writing has kind of moved a little bit closer to people's everyday routine, which is a beautiful thing.
That's great. Yeah. So Dave, this has been awesome. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us this week.
My pleasure, Brian. Anytime.
Thanks for listening to The Other 51. Show notes for this and all of our episodes can be found at sportsmediaguide.com by clicking on the Other 51 tab. If you like the show, please consider giving it a rating and a review, either at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. It really does help people find the show. Our theme music is by Ellie Moritz.